friends. A warm welcome to each of you who's joined us here today, and a special welcome to Professor Krishna Menon and Professor Rajeev Bhargava, who are here to share with us their thoughts on some of the current issues on conserving the past, and to Sushila Ravindranath, who will moderate today's discussion. Intach, the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, was founded in 1984, 36 years ago, as a non-profit organization for preserving India's vast and unprotected cultural heritage that consists of built heritage, natural heritage, and intangible heritage. Today, Intach is considered as one of the largest heritage organizations both in India and the world, and we have 212 chapters across the country. In Chennai chapter, we've been having programs and initiatives that have done their bit to preserving heritage as well as to promote heritage awareness. So recently, we've had these online programs. We've had an expert from the UK joining us to tell us about injecting life into existing buildings. And then we had a panel discussion with Leo Saldana and Surit Patsati a couple of weeks ago on the EIA draft notification. And most recently, we had a talk on sacred plants by Dr. Nandita Krishna. We have lined up a few more programs in the coming weeks, and we welcome all of you to join us for those. Just a few announcements. These forthcoming programs will be on Instagram and the Facebook page of Intach Chennai chapter. Those of you who would like to get in touch with us, please mail at intachchennai@gmail.com. This ID I will also type onto the chat box. And today's and future programs can be watched live on YouTube on our Intach Chennai chapter channel. So if any of your friends are joining in late, are not able to access this platform, please let them know that they can watch it live on the YouTube channel. I request all of you to please stay muted right through the program, just to make sure there's no, to minimize audio disturbance.
This discussion is to help the state and citizens to get a better understanding of short-term and long-term implications of often contradictory and conflicting points of view. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two eminent speakers. Professor A.G.K. Menon is an architect and urban planner practicing in Delhi since 1972. As a founding member of Intach, he has carried out pioneering urban conservation works around the country and contributed to defining the theoretical and professional parameters of discipline in the Indian context. Professor Menon drafted the Charter for the Conservation of Architectural Heritage and Sites in India in 2004. He has been actively involved in education and co-founded the KVB School of Habitat Studies in 1990. He continues to contribute professionally through critical writing and activism to promote public good. Professor Rajeev Bhargava retired as professor at Center for Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, Delhi, and currently is an honorary fellow and director of the Center's Institute of Indian Thought. He's been a professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and was also head Department of Political Science, the University of Delhi. He is an honorary fellow, Balliol College, Oxford. Professor Bhargava is one of the principal consultants for the UNDP report on cultural liberty. He writes a fortnightly column for the Hindu. His work on secularism and methodological individualism is internationally acclaimed. He is currently working on religious and philosophical pluralism in ancient Indian thought. So may I request Professor Menon to start off the discussion?
Okay. Hi everyone. I think you've laid down a huge agenda, and so I begin by limiting that agenda because obviously we can't discuss everything about the problems of conservation in India. We're only focusing on one particular issue that has been in the public domain recently, which is if the past is reinterpreted, how does it impact the conservation of the monuments, which are already being conserved? So reevaluating the future of the past in the light of contemporary interpretations of history. I think I would like to sort of contextualize that by saying that we have to look at how we conserve in India. What are the rules that we follow? What are the practices that we follow? Which is provoking us to question all this. Because if you're questioning a certain practice, what is that practice? So to begin with, we've got to be very clear that our practices are really based on colonial impositions. Colonial laws, colonial practices told us how to conserve our monuments, which had been built by other traditions and other philosophical positions. So there is at once a certain conflict here that we find that conservationists follow a certain principle, which is universal, and the universal can be further clarified to say it's Eurocentric. So that Eurocentric philosophy is used to conserve Indian monuments. Now that obviously creates a problem with the local population because while the conservators look at these monuments in a very objective, scientific way and then wonder how history is interpreted and whether it should be done or not done, the local people look at it more empathetically. And that empathy is the difference between what has happened perhaps in the US and what we are talking about today, which I want to elaborate upon. If you empathize with the monument, you relate to it differently. You want its future in a different way. If you don't empathize with it, you might want to destroy it, and that will be perfectly in order as far as the system is concerned. But if you look at it objectively as a historian, you cannot change the past. So you cannot change the monument that represents the past. So I think that I just want to lay it out that that conflict is there. And that conflict makes profound problems for conservation in India. Should the changing interpretations of events, whether it's good or bad, determine how monuments are conserved? So there are multiple views, and we are only going to be looking at the Indian context. We are not going to look at the American context or the British context, because that's what's come in the news. When we say that monuments are being destroyed in America and the US because of all this, it doesn't really concern today's debate. We are interested how it impacts our view, the way we look at our monuments. So in a way, to begin, I would like to emphasize that this discussion will throw light on, shall we say, the foundational questions of how we conserve, why we conserve, what we conserve, and who decides what we conserve. So these are some of the questions that I hope to elaborate upon. And so the ideology, as I said, is something that we've got to keep in mind. This ideology is based on colonial laws, and after independence, they got accommodated in the international charters advocated by UNESCO, which are also largely Eurocentric. There have been attempts, even by UNESCO, to accommodate more local views. For example, there's the Nara Charter of UNESCO, which accommodates the Japanese view. There is the Barra Charter of Australia that accommodate the aboriginal views of conservation. But there has been no such attempt in India, except as the introduction mentioned, that I did try and document an Indian charter. But
The mic for Intach Chennai chapter is on.
Oh, Margaret. But can you hear me?
No, sir, we can hear double voice.
Oh, double. Okay. Hello, is it okay?
It's fine. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah. Now, there's a very interesting example as far as Haji is concerned in India, and that is the Archaeological Survey of India has begun to permit worship in mosques, protected mosques. For example, the Taj Mahal, they allow worship on Friday when the public is not allowed.
Sorry, Poggy, there is still an echo.
Okay, okay.
Still an echo.
Oh. Hello.
There's someone from Intach Chennai can rectify it.
I think it's done, sir. We can continue.
Okay, okay. So the example I wanted to say in India is that we are permitting worship in mosques even if they're protected. This is interesting. They're not being handed over to the minority community, but they're allowed to worship. So there's a small nuance there that unlike Babri Masjid where it has been demolished, here you're allowing worship and it continues as a tourist attraction. So I just like to highlight that as far as Hagia Sophia is concerned, the lessons that we can learn and discuss. Then we come to the third example, the redevelopment of Central Vista, which is of course an ongoing issue, and it has many of the larger issues conflated in it. What to conserve, how do you conserve it, who conserves it, who decides? For example, the redevelopment of Central Vista is the dream of the leader, and we are spending 20,000 crores to fulfill that dream. Did the conservationists think of redeveloping the Central Vista? Because I say that because it is a grade 1 heritage precinct. According to the law, according to the master plan of Delhi, it is a grade 1 structure. And yet, we have no say, the conservationists have no say on how it is to be conserved and what should be done in future. In fact, the government is not even consulting the people, let alone experts. They've appointed an architect who then decides what to do, and they're saying we're conserving the place. How are we conserving the place? We're keeping the shell of the building and making it a museum. It is a perfectly functioning building, North Block, South Block, ministries, Parliament building, the Parliament of India, and it's all going to be turned into shells. And they claim it is conservation. We're conserving. What are you complaining about? Or take the Central Vista, for example. They're saying, yes, what are people complaining about? The trees are there, the vista is there, the ponds are there, Central Vista is still there, but devoid of the spirit of the place. Here was a public place which is now going to be converted into a gated government office area. And we know it's going to be gated because if you go to the North Block, South Block, you're not allowed to go there freely because the ministries are there, the barriers and police barriers, and you can go there to take selfies. And that's what's going to happen to Central Vista, and they're claiming that we're conserving this place by doing it. So there are enormous problems. But what is it that we conserve in a place like Central Vista? It is a conflicted history, of course. It's a colonial and imperial capital, which is now the capital of a democratic republic. And we have owned it. As India, we owned it. We are proud of it. On January 26th, we have our parades there. So it is not as though that we are ashamed of it. We are extremely proud of it. And yet, we want to modify it on what grounds? What are the grounds? Are we consulting experts? In fact, the irony is, you talk to the government, they say, oh, we will do a heritage impact assessment. We will do an environment impact assessment after the project is done or after the project is designed. Completely upending everything. And the other interesting thing they say is that we are following the laws. How are they following the laws? They're changing the laws. The master plan is changed. So whether it's a grade 1 monument, now the master plan allows it to happen, it allows it to happen, so we are following the laws. Or the Delhi Urban Arts Commission permits it, or the Environment Impact Assessment Committee permits it. So we are following the laws. So you see the whole, shall we say, the charade of conservation. And why did the charade happen? Because, as I told you right in the beginning, the laws are colonial. It has colonial implications. It has colonial objectives. And it's only now that the brown sahibs have taken over the colonial imperatives and deciding how the Indian monument should be conserved. So the Black Lives Matter, Hagia Sophia, and the redevelopment of Central Vista are an opportunity for us, conservationists, other professionals, and society to reflect. How is it that we want to look at our past and hand it over to a future generation? In fact, many intelligent people say that Central Vista is an empty space. And so what is wrong with the government in building these buildings? So you see how we lost the plot. We lost the narrative. It's entirely now a development narrative. It is to be developed. And we also lost the narrative in the sense that people are now saying, oh, a leader is allowed to take a decision. Why he's taking a decision? Of course, he's allowed to take a decision. But there is a very fine line between deciding and how and what you decide on. What you decide on is determined by experts. Of course, the political leadership finally decides. Even in the UK, even in America, it is the political leadership that decides, not the conservationists. But the conservationist says what ought to be done. And the leader then decides accordingly. If you read, for example, the latest Town Planning Acts of UK, it says very clearly, the Secretary Environment will decide. There's no doubt about it. It's the Secretary Environment who will decide. But based on the advice of the town planners and the professionals. Now that is something that we can learn about the redevelopment of Central Vista. And the Central Vista is not only about heritage, it's about urban development in general. Urban development in general is now being done by administrators, politicians, developers, not by town planners, not by experts. So our cities are at the mercy of who decides. And who decides are not the experts, but the people in power. So with those three examples, these are the issues that I want to raise. In conclusion, all I like to say is that there's a very ironic joke that I want to recite, which is that you always said that if in the West, the conservationist catches a cold, the Indian conservator sneezes. And I'm afraid this is what is happening here. In the West, they are they are having a cold because, the Black Lives Matter and Hagia Sophia and all this is happening, and we are sneezing. Now, the purpose of my discussion today here is to point out that, we have no reason to catch a cold because they got a cold. We have our own problems, we have our own maladies, we have our own COVIDs, we've got our own problems. Let us try and solve our problems ourselves. One of the things in the conservation movement that's coming is that because we cannot solve our problems, let us get international people to help us. In Central Vista, for example, they're saying, let us get the international community to come and protest. And I said, look, I protest. This is our problem. We're going to sort it out. This is what happened 200 years ago. 200 years ago, one Raja having a fight with another Raja couldn't decide amongst themselves, so they invite a third person, the East India Company, to come and help them. And lo and behold, 200 years later, you're taken over. So that may not happen here today in 2020. We may not be taken over by the international community, but our minds will be taken over. Our processes will be taken over. Our objectives will be taken over. And we will not be our own agents to determine how we should conserve, what we should conserve, and who do we conserve for. So those are some of the points I wanted to make open up for discussion. Thank you very much. Sushila, would you like to take over?
Unmute yourself, Sushi.
Okay, now?
That's fine.
So may I now invite Professor Bhargava to give his point of view. How do we look at all these things from an ethical point of view? There are so many conflicting, contradictory opinions which can arise out of these points of view which have been raised. So now I invite Professor Bhargava to come in.
Thank you very much. Thank Professor Menon for his remarks, and I'm sort of provoked to actually not look at the specific issues in detail. I will talk about those issues, but only as examples that fit a more general framework that I will provide. That's my training, and that's. But I do take seriously the four foundational questions that are being raised by Mr. Ravindranath and by which are what is to conserve, must we conserve, which is actually related to the other question, what is it that we do not want to conserve? The second, of course, is why do we have to conserve? For what justifications do we offer for conservation? And the third, of course, is how do we preserve? How do we conserve? Which are the forms? Which are the sites? In what form do we conserve whatever it is that we wish to conserve? And finally, the question: who decides? So I'll try to kind of a philosophical and ethical take each four questions during the course of this presentation. So on the first question, what is to, I think the short answer is our heritage. It begs the question, what is heritage? It's certainly not everything that we have. Always in some selection. And ideas in what constitutes heritage. Past that we want to live, that we want to live in, that we want to bring. So that's very, very much one important component of heritage. But the second component of heritage is what that we presently think is significant. So it is not just any. It's what we believe to be value past, what we believe is worth creating, and rather than whatever it is that we wish to forget, whatever it is not to celebrate, and so on. Now, there is, of course, one other area which is somewhere in between. There are lots of things that we want to remember only because we do not want them to happen again. We want to prevent them from happening again. We go to, for example, we don't just go there to he's fascinated by one of his own countrymen. If you look at Vietnam Memorial, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, two very extraordinary memorials. These are monuments of public apology. They express regret. So, treatment not to allow these things to happen again. So remembering itself is a little complicated. We don't want to forget everything. There are lots of things we want to forget, but things we want to learn not just to celebrate, but also for other reasons. Okay, the second, of course, the second important question is why? Why is it that we wish to conserve and remember And here, I think a very simple answer, we have to be quick about these things. A very simple answer is that contributes to our collective self. That it, in some ways, is part of identity. It affirms our identity, is part of our narrative, which constitutes our collective and creation of individual selves. It's a source, and I'm irritatingly, but it's a source of these are items which are a source of pride, and now there's never going to be an agreement on what it is that we find significant. There's always some disagreement. There are always disputes. There are always conflicts, because what is affirming, what is self-affirming, is demeaning to others. Gives pride to some, actually is what gives comfort to some, what makes people feel at home. That is precisely that which is also profound discomfort to another. So a heritage for some people makes other people, gives us a sense of restraint to other people. It is a source of exclusion to other people. In fact, some of this is deeply insulting and offensive to others. So heritage is contested. There is no way that we can avoid these conflicts, and particularly not only that us, but also deeply and gratified for centuries. So I would like then, so if we look at conflicted heritages, I would like to think that there are three forms of conflicts. One kind of conflicted heritage is the conflicts that surround heritage, those conflicts are for inclusion on free and equal terms. Heritage is part of that struggle, a part of a struggle for freedom and equality. So there are many symbols, iconic symbols, many symbols that are symbols of oppression. And I'm thinking of the statue of Cecil Rhodes, for example. There's a lot of controversy over that. Prof already mentioned there are all sorts of issues being raised in America by the Black Lives Movement, and even in India, as I'll come to that. So these are some people who have been privileged and who derive pleasure from whatever it is that has been a symbol of oppression. People are bound to be hurt. There is a hurt to manufacture hurt. And there are lots of other people, perhaps the majority of people, who will find that these symbols of oppression must go. Now, how it has to go is another issue. That is the question of how we conserve. But this is one very important where conflict over heritage takes place. Second is conflict as a result of struggle for recognition. When there is or marginalized, and it's for a space, of inescapably public space, where it can also represent itself, where it can manifest its own, what it considers to be its own symbols, its own identities. And here, I would say, in the broader international context, of what happens in Hagia Sophia and what happened, for example, in the Mesquita, cathedral in Bhargava, and indeed what happened in India around Babi Masjid. All these are struggles for either assertion in many cases, it's a struggle for recognition by groups which have been defeated or which have been marginalized. And I think third source of conflict, and that source of conflict actually is an overlap of both. It combines, and there are many such instances where you cannot say that this is one or the other, where cultural oppression itself is the issue. And heritage is part of this broader struggle. So, question. Who decides? And I think I'm pretty clear about it. I mean, this is these issues which have long-lasting importance to a whole people. These issues cannot be decided by. I think it cannot be decided even by an elected government. So this whole issue of Central Vista for me, on simple ground, is a no-no. It just is a real kind of a product. If any change there is a product of illusions of grandeur on the part of one person, or it is something that is imposed by an elected government, which after comes and goes. It's for 5 years, may be there for 10. But we are dealing with issues of heritage which are much more, which have a long day. So I think elected, but which concern everyone, and certainly architects, artists, philosophers, historians, all and others, anybody who's interested, alert, guardians of cultural memory, where they are. I mean, all of them have a stake in it, and all of them should be part of this decision body. It cannot be decided a few people, and shouldn't protest if it happens to be decided at the whim of a leader or by elected government, no matter how many sort of votes that government managed to get. I don't think there is a good justification. I think there is another, I think a very good example, which Professor Menon mentioned, of at least a broader, a decision being taken after a broader consultation. It was inconclusive, but still, there was more consultation in the 1960s when it was decided that while George Fitz statue, which had been removed earlier, that should not be there. It's a long time to have it empty, a reminder that we are a republic and that we will not rule by one monarch or one dictator. I think that leaving it empty is a very, very fine decision. I think there was a proposal that Gandhi should have been put there, but it would be deeply for to have somebody like Gandhi with his stand facing the Rashtrapati Bhavan, or which was the former Viceroy's arms. I think to leave it empty was a very fine decision, and I think that decision came because of the intention on the part of the government to actually have broader consultation. I would say that there are certain considerations to statues of historical figures. There are some considerations which are relevant and which must be taken into account. One is that a decision to preserve them or to remove them, that decision cannot be taken on that. Secondly, active passion should not be a decisive factor in whether you are removing them or preserving them. I'm not suggesting that feelings do not matter. Professor Menon talked about empathy. Of course, feelings matter, but feelings are not just physical perturbation. When you have a fear about something, you can be having fear on extremely irrational grounds. All our feelings also in certain claims which can be true or false, or right or wrong, and feelings should be part of our consideration. But I said they can be the decisive consideration. I also believe that narrow standards of political correctness cannot be the basis of what is to go and what is to stay. Statutes cannot be dislodged on the basis of current ideas of what is politically correct. I think this is a point fits in with the other point that I made, that we need a much larger consultative body, which may take a much longer time to arrive at some decision. But I think I would sort of tend to emphasize this point that of political correctness should not be allowed to prevail. So what should be the main criteria? I would say that it should be, we must rely on complex adjustments which are based on a person's overall contribution to intellectual life. There is nobody who's perfect. There are all kinds of flaws, and some of these flaws are really flaws that accrue to people because there are general deficiencies in an entire era. Nobody is really free of them. I mean, I mentioned today in the column I wrote, you can take a patriarchy test, and you'll find that all great figures will fail that test. Karl Marx will not pass it. Ambedkar, our greatest Dalit icon, pass it. Martin Luther King will not pass it. I mean, all these people had very flawed views of women, and they treated women in a equal way. But that is not a reason. That alone cannot be a reason to take their statues off. So I think there are some people who would pass this. I think Mahatma Gandhi does pass this test, and we can talk. But like Cecil Rhodes or Edward Colston doesn't pass this. I mean, Rhodes remained consistently. He was a racist. He was a colonialist. He believed in the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon race, and he did not give up these views till the end of his life. The case. So I would say that, and finally, of course, I've been talking about statues or other symbols or other features or elements of heritage are inescapably public. I mean, as we've done in the case of George V, we put it in a coronation park. I think we can do that case of even people like Cecil Rhodes. I mean, they can be put in a museum which is on the history of slavery. And I would say that even when you have a statue of Gandhi, maybe you should write a little text. Perfect when there were some things about which he was wrong, but I think there's no reason to take the statues of inescapably public arenas. But there is a case for taking these away from these arenas. But destruct is something that I would say is a last resort. I mean, if 20 years of struggle does not produce a response from the powers, then I suppose they are left with no option but to do something like that. But I think at some point of time there is people should all sit together and decide and be the best way to go. Okay, I'll end there.
Sushi, will you take over?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. So, thank you, Professor Menon, Professor Bhargava. You've given us very interesting points to ponder upon, but we still have to decide who decides. So I want both of you to explain, in a democracy, what happens. Every leader, even if they are there only for 5 years, they want to leave some kind of monument for themselves, some figure, some building, and they're not bothered about destroying them. So how do we deal with that situation? Professor Menon?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Professor Bhargava has raised very important issues, which as conservation professionals we normally don't consider, but they're absolutely important. But it raises the answer to the question that you asked. How do we accomplish all the issues? How do we solve all these problems? And I think here I'd like to stress the fact the object is not the purpose, it's the process. If you follow a proper process, whatever the results are, I think would be satisfactory. So quite often in conservation, we try and go for a perfect solution and we compromise the process. This consultation is, when we say public discourse, when we say negotiated decision-making, all this takes time. All this requires a process. And no conservator is really taught how to go about it. They're taught the technical factors of how to conserve an object. But the human angles, which is how do you deal with morality, ethics, how to deal with social equity. These are all issues that have been raised by Professor Bhargava about conservation. And conservation cannot escape these questions. And as conservators, as conservation professionals, we've got to see how to accommodate it. Now, either we have a team or we have a long process where we negotiate all these things, and slowly over time, when we talk about the Black Lives Movement, it is not a 1 week immediate response. You know, when you say that it was a response to political correctness, I slightly disagree in the sense that it was 150 years of negotiation going on. Since, 1865, this thing has been going, this decision has been going on. And in 2020, and in 1960s, they had their laws changed. And even then, 50 years later, all this has happened. So what I'd like to learn from that is that these kind of decisions are negotiated. The process is important. Everyone has to be accommodated. And this is the only way to do it. There's no correct answer. No one can say that this is the best way of doing things. It has to be left to a process that evolves slowly, and which as many people can be accommodated, should be accommodated. So that's the only answer I can give for that.
Yeah. So I think I was misunderstood Professor Menon, I wasn't talking about the Black Lives Movement when I was talking about political correctness. I had the statues of Gandhi in mind. Not the statues of slave owners. I think the black issue is, I mean, slavery was abolished in the 1860s or even earlier, and there was a major civil war which took place. And yet, almost 100 years later, we still needed a civil rights movement. There were lots of setbacks to the act of abolition of slavery. And these were not just social setbacks, they were legal setbacks. All kinds of laws were made to discourage people from abandoning slavery. So I think I completely agree with you. That is a very different issue. 200 years of colonialism. I mean, those are struggles that have been taking place for 100 years. I'm not surprised that statues come down the way they have come down now. But I'm talking about other, when I was talking about overall consideration and not going by political correctness, I mean, if we look at many other statues, including the statue of, say, Gandhi, those are the issues that we have to face. So on the issue of who decides, I think I made it very clear that I'm, I don't know, maybe we are completely helpless. Maybe we don't have the voice. Maybe we are living in a political system which doesn't allow for any of what we want. But we should just, at least we can acknowledge it if we can't go out and protest. But the fact is that, as Professor Menon also pointed out, this has to be a long-term process. I mean, these are not issues. Governments are there to make policies and to enact laws which are to do largely with the present, and over which they actually need some consensus, at least within the parliament, right? I mean, at least that the deliberation in the parliament, going through the entire procedure, at least that is something that they have to. But when it comes to big issues like, whether to conserve a monument or not, or whether to have a statue installed in the under the canopy behind or facing India Gate, I mean, those are issues which will. I mean, it would be odd if somebody is going to install a statue now and then some other person will come 5 years later and take that statue out, and then a third one will be installed. I mean, that's not the way we look at our monuments. I mean, statues are easy prey because they're smaller, but I mean, they should be seen alongside monuments, which you cannot simply get rid of that easily. And I think the decisions that apply to monuments must also apply to statues.
Rajeev, it's a serious issue, but if I can just crack a small joke here, the Romans faced the same problem. Leaders would come and go, and each leader wants to put a statue. So they invented a very interesting solution, which was the body was there, the head kept changing. A new leader came, they put a new head. But the statue remained in the public place, it was still there. And they changed the head. So, solutions can be found.
Near the parliament.
Yes.
So near the parliament, we should have probably something like this Roman practice,
Yes.
when we can have a statue which can keep changing all its heads. But I think parliament, somewhere near the parliament is fine. But I think anywhere else, I don't think. I mean, where we have to conserve is a very, very important question. I think that is a question that we have to really address that much. But where should people who we look up to, people who we think of as exemplars, people who we wish to celebrate, people who we want to live with us even though they're physically not there, where they should be. I think that's where exactly they should be. Where should they be located, situated? I think that's a very important question for us.
Yeah. No, I think.
Sushi, unmute, please.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No, as I said, statues may be easier to deal with, but when it comes to monuments, like I want both your views on Central Vista. How can a government just take a decision? How does one create a public awareness about this? How does it one do without instilling a sense of heritage and why this should be done with a lot of consultation, as like Professor Menon said, with town planners, not just government employed engineers taking decisions? How do we resolve issues like this? We can't take there can't be long-term solutions. This has to be here and now. When this government is here, something has to be done. How do we do that?
Well, all I have to say is that one of the things that Intach Chennai chapter is doing is to increase public awareness. Obviously, that's a very strong and strategic move. The public must be aware of the fact that these are not decisions made behind closed doors or behind professional walls. These are public decisions, and they have to be involved. And the only way they can be involved is in events like that you are trying to run, to make more people aware of the complexities of the issues. So the Central Vista, you'll have both sides. Some people say you've got to redevelop it. Some people say you don't have to do it. Other people say do it this way. Another person says do it a third way. But basically it comes down to the fact that you got to consult. You got to make it transparent. You got to make it much more democratic. So I think that's the way forward. So we got to retrieve a democracy. So the Central Vista project, as far as the lesson I learned from that is, of course, there are a lot of things that have gone wrong with conservation, but a lot of things have gone wrong with our governance. Means if we cannot democratically decide public places, then why are we discussing the nuances of conservation? Who is it for? For ourselves only then, not for the public, because the public is not involved. So if you really mean that it has to be a public discussion, there has to be negotiated decision making, a lot of points of views have been brought in, and that takes time. It's not going to be done today. The Central Redevelopment project should have been done 20 years ago. They should have started a talk. And then maybe today something could have been worked out what to be done. But instead, what happens is that government comes for 5 years and they say, well, in 5 years we're going to do it. And that's exactly what's happening here. In 2019, the government decides that we'll do it. It has to be done by 2024. My God, it's unimaginable. It violates not only protocols of conservation, it violates protocols of governance, it violates protocols of democracy, it violates everything that is we hold here. So that's Central Vista. And I'm glad that you're bringing it out in the open here for discussion. We should have many more such discussions.
So, Professor Bhargava, what do you feel about it?
No, let's take another example of conflicted heritage. I mentioned, we have also mentioned the Cordoba Mosque Cathedral. I remember a Turkish friend of mine telling me some time back that in 2010, a person who had converted recently to Islam, he came to the cathedral, or the mosque cathedral, and he wanted to pray inside. And in fact, he was of course not allowed to do that, but he then got his rug out and prayed outside the cathedral. What he wanted to do was something that happens in some ways in the Church of the Holy sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is that the same monument can be used by by three different sects of Christianity. That happens in Jerusalem. He wanted in the mosque, that mosque cathedral, the same thing. He wanted Muslims and Christians to pray together inside the mosque. And in fact, he actually tried to persuade his prime minister in Spain. He wanted to persuade his prime minister to write to the Turkish president that they should also try to make, because there was already a lot of movement to turn it into a mosque. And he wanted the mosque, he wanted Hagia Sophia to be turned into a place which can be used not only as a museum, but also as a place where both Muslims and people who follow Eastern Orthodoxy, Christian Orthodox Church, they could all go and pray there. So I think we have imaginative solutions like that. I mean, I'm afraid this neither of the governments didn't agree to it, and the two religions didn't agree. I mean, spokesperson of the two religions didn't agree to it. But it is not as if this has not happened in the past. This happened even during the wars of religion, when when the Protestants tried to displace Catholicism in some areas in Western Europe. Of course, it was, there was a lot of extermination, expulsion, but in smaller sites where people tolerated each other, they shared the place of faith in their own ways. So I think these are imaginative solutions that we can think of when it comes to monuments which have a conflicted history and which seems like impossible to resolve. But ordinary people come up with important such solutions. And I think we have a practice in India. I mean, all our shrines are visited by Hindus and Muslims alike. And I think that this is a practice that we can encourage even in places which are disputed. So I don't know whether that will, I mean, this is only maybe it's just a dream at the moment, but I think if we had dreamt like that about 30, 40 years ago, I think we would have succeeded in realizing it. We just missed that opportunity.
Well, I don't think we did, because we did dream it. Our constitution did dream it.
Yes.
Somehow our constitution is being hijacked.
Yes, and that it's been happening for 40 years now.
Yes.
It's not. I mean, we a lot of people are to blame here. It's not just one section. I think many things which should have been done in the 60s and 70s were not done, and we are facing the consequences of that now.
Professor Menon, before we open this to questions, you were actually talking about this is a strange situation in this country that the majority is feeling aggrieved more than the minority.
Yeah.
So when did this transition happen?
It's been happening for 2,000 years. Transition hasn't taken place. I think the majority has unfortunately kept the minority completely invisible. And that has continued. So, I'm afraid our whole idea of culture, our whole idea of civilization is a majoritarian point of view. And when we say those have to be conserved, we still have not come to terms with 2,000 years of a conflicted history. So, yes, it has to be done. I think it should be done. If we are civilized people as we claim, we've got to begin some point. And and I sort of enjoyed this discussion, because when you asked for it, I said, yes, here's an opportunity to reflect on how to do it. When you suddenly realize that your history is conflicted and this is represented by heritage, how do you conserve it? The tail begins to wag the dog. So we may be talking about the tail, but we are really talking about a much larger issue in our country. So thank you for asking the question. Yeah.
So, yeah, okay, I just,
yeah.
I slightly disagree that this has been happening for 2,000 years. I think this is a 300 years problem.
Okay.
It's not I wouldn't go that far back.
Okay.
I think, there are many parts of India. I mean, for example, the Vedic Brahminical religion, if you might call it that. I mean, they didn't even believe in temples, leave alone having statues in temples.
Yeah.
All that they did was to have a temporary sacred space where they had their ritual. And once the ritual was over, that place was gone, and that sacredness was gone with it. So it isn't. I mean, this idea of having. I mean, I don't know when they. I mean, the Buddhists and the Jains were the first to have statues. The so-called, the Brahmins, they were not even interested in building statues. Yeah. So I'm not surprised that there are, in many parts of India, there are not as many temples as, I mean, some temples have been destroyed, there's no denying that. But I mean, the fact that we don't have an overcrowded temple space till 30 years ago. Now suddenly temples have grown everywhere. So I don't think this is not a major issue. 300, 400 years ago. I think these are new conflicts which began really in the 18th century. The Babri Masjid thing is very disputable. I really don't know whether we have evidence of. I mean, that itself became disputed only about 150 years ago.
Yes.
I don't know. So I think we have an ancient reservoir of practices which are deeply inclusive and tolerant of one another. We had other forms of intolerances, and actually that relates me to the other point. I think we have a parallel to a majority not sympathizing with the minority in another sense, and that is the Dalit question.
Yes.
I think that's where the history of, I mean, that's a history of slavery in some ways.
But that's what I was referring to, yeah, really. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah, I mean, the Hindu-Muslim or the Hindu-Christian issue, this is much more, but if we have 2,000 years of a problem, then and I think that's an issue that we have to address. Where are those of heritage which the Dalits can claim as their own? I mean, it's not as if they didn't have their gods and witches. They've all been either appropriated and they've become Brahmanized,
yes,
or they are, or they're forgotten and still remembered. We don't see them around. There are no public expressions, and I think so. A lot of work has to be done. Yeah.
I don't know. They were not even allowed inside temples till about I don't know, somewhere in the middle of 20th century, early 20th century. So, question of Dalit monuments, are they there? I mean, do we have any historical reference to them? Do we?
Well, I think that's a sort of a very complex question to ask. For example, we often think that Africa didn't have a history. We, for example, think that the Aboriginal people did not have a history. And I think they had a different kind of history, a different kind of monument, different kind of heritage. I think those are things that we're going to learn. For example, when the Barachata came in Australia, where were the monuments? But yet they said that there was an Aboriginal culture that had to be respected, conserved, and celebrated. And they went about doing it. So I think when we talk about heritage and monuments and conservation, there's a linearity that is extremely majoritarian. There could be other narratives. There could be other ways of looking at heritage, other ways of celebrating the past.
I just would like to ask, are we getting more and more majoritarian now?
All over the world we are. I think that's a sort of a political economy is leading towards it, and I think all over the world we're finding that, whether it's Turkey or Philippines or India or China or anywhere in America. What is Trump? What is Boris Johnson? You know, these are all things that in one form or the other are examples of a very minor majoritarian point of view, minority view that is majoritarian. They are extremely exclusive views, not inclusive views.
Dr. Bhargava, what do you think? How do we fight this majoritarianism? When the philosophy is tending toward...
I think we really have to, I mean, in the Indian context, I think I could say just things. One is that we are fortunate to have, and if only showed our faith and fought for it when they come. I think we can get back on track. The other thing, and this is the point that Professor Menon raised about Eurocentric we've been. I think we really need. Is it? Am I audible? I think this decolonization is a long process. And I think we are nowhere near, I think, reaching the end of it. As a matter of fact, that new form of decolonization of the mind, which arose immediately after our political independence. So I think we need to examine that much more carefully and look not many of our practices through the prism of Eurocentric categories. Once we begin to do that, I think we will be able to excavate them and learn more than we have done so far. I mean, this whole majoritarian business is frankly a European. This is part of the European discourse. Our whole understanding of our religion is because we have borrowed the entire category of religion and imposed on the way that we related to our gods and goddesses, the way we construct our own traditions of faith. And so I think if you start looking at religion as doctrinal and as which are with bounded communities, which are rivals of each other because they're fighting for for converting one or the other person to their faith. I think if once you begin to do that, then you have sort of problems that we do. I don't think we had that. I mean, there was some sections and some phases in India where we did countering forces which didn't allow these kind of what now majoritarian closest to them. There is a pluralist past that India started invoking it and relating to. Right? The Constitution actually tried to capture some of that. It has modernized some things, and it has tried to keep the spirit that pluralism alive. And I think if we are able to do that, taking our democracy seriously and not reducing it to mere electoral democracy, and if we if we have our faith in our constitution, I think that's the way to go forward, really. I mean, it's very hard, particularly in these times, to think like that. But I mean, what option do we have? I mean, we have to look at whatever straws are put onto them, and I would say that these are absolutely necessary. And this is and conservation. This is part of a much a broader issue and struggle. So, yeah.
This is why I find that conservation is a very important discipline, because it tackles not only the problem of history, but the problem of everything else that we are today. And how we conserve becomes an issue that has an implication much more than what the monument we are focusing on. So today's discussion, really, I want to sort of stress the point that we're talking about issues that are far more than removing of statues or Hagia Sophia or Central Vista. It has to do with a much larger perspective of ourselves, our society, our nation, our civilization, our culture, etc. So that is why negotiation is important, inclusion is important, and the process is extremely important. If you can't stress process to make any kind of decision, we're back to majoritarianism. Whoever decides becomes the person who makes the decision. And we got to accept the fact, no, to include everyone else, we got to discuss and discuss. In fact, I recall one of the rationale for the Central Vista is that the architect says, oh, if we consulted the people, we'd never do this project. I thought that would have been the solution. But the architect still sincerely believes that had he not actually put his foot down and said, do this, do this, do this, the project would not have happened. And one can only say that disaster happened because of that. So that's one reading of Central Vista.
So we have to learn to be more inclusive, and Professor Menon, as you said, you have to push this local charter.
Yes.
Like they did in Japan and Australia. And
yes. But the complexity is that, again, all this, if you take the conservation profession, because I'm fairly involved in the conservation profession, if I talk to the colleagues, the idea of modernity dominates. They want to be as modern as the Europeans, as modern as the rest of the world. And so they denigrate what we have, our past. So that is a problem also, isn't it? That's where this thing about majoritarianism comes. That's what Professor Bhargava was saying, the Eurocentrism, that we are somehow captured in that worldview, that we've got to be as good as anyone else. We can't be as good as we are, but we've got to be good as someone else. Our cities have to be world class. Our conservation has to be like what Europe does, etc. So these are issues that I hope a session like this begins to question, and people go back with some kind of a doubt in their mind that maybe they're going to rethink this entire conservation process and narrative.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have some time to take questions?
I also wanted to.
Sorry?
I just wanted to add. Can I just add a thing?
Yes, please.
I think displacing Europe from the center is not the same ignoring and stopping ourselves from learning from it. I think what we need is decentering Europe, which is, I don't think that it follows from an attack on Eurocentrism that now we should become nativists. I think what we have to fight for is an equality of peoples all over the world, where each culture, or even if you want to use the term civilization, each civilization has a voice. I'm sure Professor Menon will agree with me that neither of us was actually advocating that we have a new kind of indigenous.
No.
Yeah,
With one caveat, Rajeev, one caveat. Modernity, we have to be modern because we're today living today and we're going to face today's problems. And we're going to invent the solutions for today. But the point is, which solutions do we adopt? The trend has been to adopt solutions that others have invented. Whereas in conservation, in architecture, in city planning, it is so rooted in culture that the modernity has to come from the culture. So it's not nativism so much as what one would call indigenous modernity. It has to be modern, but it has to be rooted in a certain roots that reflect ourselves. So there's that thing, it's sort of a fine line between nativism and indigenous modernity has to be made. Otherwise, we throw the baby with the bathwater saying that no, don't look at anything indigenous, look at something that is modern. Modern means, again, I won't use the word Eurocentric, but it tends to be values that are developed by Eurocentrism, which becomes a problem. And if you're a conservationist and you try and say that, look, I've got to conserve this ruin as a ruin, the local population will look at you aghast and say, look, that's not conservation. Conservation is to rebuild this building. I want this temple again. I want to worship on it in this place again. But a conservationist trained in the Eurocentric point of view will see that no, conservation is preserving history as we inherited it. So you see, we get into these profound issues that are much deeper than the object that we're discussing. Sushila?
Sushi, please unmute yourself. Sushi, please unmute yourself.
Okay?
Yeah.
No, I said this is such a complex issue that if I throw more questions at you, we can discuss this for hours to come, because in a complex country like India, each region thinks differently what to preserve and not to preserve. As you know, in Tamil Nadu and Chennai, we just put up statues and pull them down, and maybe every week. So, Sujata, do we have time for questions?
Maybe just
maybe one or two.
Yeah, just a couple of questions, and Tara can do the summing up, please.
Yeah. Can you post the questions?
I ask the audience if he wants to ask a question.
Yeah. Please, please.
If anybody would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Sushi, if there are no
questions. Are we able to get questions? I can't see any.
No. I think if there are no questions, you can ask Tara to start.
Okay. So as we are not getting any questions, Tara, may I ask you to sum up this session? And give your concluding remarks?
Yeah. Thank you, Sushi. Before I thank the speakers, Professor A.J.K. Menon and Professor Rajeev Bhargava, and also the moderator, Ms. Sushila Ravindranath, I would just like to say 4 things about evaluating and conserving built heritage that has limited our perspective on the past. This has come out, all these, what I'm going to say, I have written it earlier, but both of you have expressed it in the course of the talk. So for cogency, let me just read out what I have written. The first thing is, built heritage is not merely the name of the ruler who built it and the use it was put to. It reflects the society of the time, the skills and technology, the travel of aesthetics from far and near, its adaptation to the local, the story of distance and difficulties in the procurement of materials. It is in fact the story of traders, artisans, and communities that have built this built heritage. Our history and even conservation studies have not acknowledged the contribution of the people who physically made these monuments, and because of that, governments and citizens have a very narrow reading and view it as ours and theirs. The second point is an important aspect that is stressed in conservation of heritage buildings, and that aspect is reversibility. However, this facet has a wider quality as well in evaluation of heritage. Reversibility can be extended to mean that we should have the humility to admit that not all understanding and solutions that we currently have are sufficient. Even as political scheming and citizens' emotions seek to destroy or demolish or transform our built heritage, it would do us good to keep reversibility in our minds. Thirdly, we are not living in a feudal era or in an era of despotic rulers. We are assessing built heritage in a democracy. Therefore, a guiding factor should be to evaluate if laid down processes as exist today are sufficient in protecting democratic values and citizen participation. A basic tenet of the rule of law is that the people have a right to know. Unfortunately, administrators often ignore this, and a culture of asymmetry of information prevails. The public almost always comes to know of projects threatening heritage well after project plans and proposals have reached a stage of implementation, leaving them with no recourse but to seek legal redress. Citizens badly require the support of forward-looking authorities. We cannot obliterate the past. We must see how to learn from it and to strengthen our democracy. We need to explore ways to introspect and set up avenues for openness, transparency, and discussion that enhances our appreciation of India's cultural diversity and traditional knowledge. I think I would have covered all the points that both of you made, and if there is anything I'd left out, my apologies. So let me conclude this session by thanking you, AJK, Rajeev, and Sushi, for your contribution to this talk. And thank you, viewers, for watching. and asking your questions. Please do send us your feedback and join in our future talks. Keep well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sujata, shall we conclude?
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.